Greetings and welcome back to Room 303, the Harvard Classic Lectures. This is lecture number 96. We are in volume number 27, English Essays, and we begin with Sir Philip Sidney's The Defense of Posey, published in 1595 after his death. Actually, it was written in 1580, but I'd like you to just think about that date of 1595. We are 5 years before Hamlet, produced on the London stage in 1600, we believe. So, what is the point of a text like this? It's, for 303, it's one of the sacred texts because it raises the real question, right? What's the value of poets and what's the value of poetry? Now here, of course, we have the great Elizabethan Renaissance argument to be made. And the influences will be prodigious. I mean, we speak regularly, and in Harvard Classics volume number 27, we will have Percy Bysshe Shelley's Defense of Poetry, and we'll give a full lecture on that one later. We've referenced it so many times in the lectures in 303. You can find so many of those at learnstrong.net that will reference that text. That text can't happen without this text. But really here as well we have the response to Plato's Republic 10. You can go and find our lectures over Plato's Republic, and especially his critique of the arts, as it's often referred to in Republic 10. And because Sidney had such respect for Plato, he had to find a way to respond. So here we have the true Renaissance Elizabethan man. We sometimes will refer to the challenge, the hope in 303 as being a warrior and a scholar. And in many ways, Sidney he exemplifies all of that. Let's do some real quick biography. Born the 30th of November 1554, and of course dies very young at the age of 34, October the 17th, 1586. There's so many great stories that we love to share around this, right? So he's in the battle. He sees that one of his colleagues does not have the armor that he is wearing, so he removes some of his armor, especially covering the thigh. It's in the thigh that he's wounded. He will refuse water that he has for a soldier lying next to him who he says needs it more, and then he'll die of gangrene a few days later. These kinds of stories will make their way all the way around, and in many ways they are a glorification of the idea that you can be both a warrior, a soldier on the battlefield, but you can also be a scholar, and certainly Sidney was all of that. I mean, when you pick up Defense of Posey and you read it, you're right away blown away by clearly the acumen and the knowledge that Sidney had of all things classical, and even he had a pretty good pulse on what was happening in his own day as well. His works, Astropho and Stella, as well as the Countess of Pembroke's Arcadia. We've given lectures at Learn Strong in the Senior A folder over Sonnet 31 with How Sad Steps, and Sonnet 39, Come Sleep. One of the standards in 303 that we've loved for years is, of course, Sidney's Thou Blind Man's Mark, that classic sonnet, Thou fool, self-chosen snare, fond fancy's scum, and dregs of scattered thought, ban of all evil, cradle of causeless care, thou web of will, whose end is never wrought, desire, desire, I have too dearly bought with mangled mind, price of mangled mind, thy worthless wear, too long asleep thou hast me brought, who should my mind to higher things prepare? And yet in vain thou hast my ruin sought. In vain thou madest me to vain things aspire. In vain thou kindlest all thy smoky fire. For virtue hath this better lesson taught. Within myself to seek my only hire. Desiring naught, but how to kill desire. Well, anybody who could write a sonnet that is so melodic, so beautiful, and so poignant. I mean, you think of the old U2 song, Desire, from Rattle and Hum, those of you who are U2 fans, and yet here it is so many years before. What is the challenge? Well, to kill desire. Of course, the irony is you can have a desire to kill desire. Sidney, the great philosopher, the great poet, and brings it all together for us in Defense of Posey. Now, I wish I could just sit and read the whole thing with you. I don't have time. But let's at least get a little bit of background knowledge here. He began writing poetry himself in 1578. His writing career really only lasted 7 or 8 years. His Defense of Posey was originally published under 2 different titles, The Defense of Posey and An Apology for Poetry. You'll remember apology here usually meaning defense. It's really, in many ways, it's thoroughgoing, and it is a vigorous argument, right? Written by somebody who actually is a poet, and he had a strong education in the classics, no question, as I've said. Now, early in the defense, Sidney will say, having slipped into the title of a poet, I am provoked to say something unto you in the defense of that my unelected vocation. And it's been the question of 303 for many years. What's the difference between writing a poem and being a poet? Playing some music and being a musician. And of course, it takes us to that notion of quality. We think about the famous Zen in the art of motorcycle maintenance and having to wrestle with the idea of what is quality. And in many ways, this is where Sidney is. He doesn't really like calling himself a poet, but he figures if I'm going to call myself a poet, I probably should defend the idea of writing poems. And he will expand the idea of poetry to everything, including the stage. That's why it's so important that we mention Shakespeare and his Hamlet of 1600. In the piece, he will defend poor poetry. He'll argue that poetry, whose final end, quote-unquote, is to lead and draw us to as high a perfection as our degenerate souls, made worse by their clayey lodgings, can be capable of. And he says poetry is the best vehicle for the purifying of wit. He forms his argument, this is important for your notes, so put it there, in a classical 7-part structure. He'll have an introduction, then he moves through these stages of proposition, division, examination, refutation to a final peroration, and then includes a custom permitted a digression on a related issue. It's, simply said, beautifully crafted. It is prose poetry. Really, it is, yeah. And of course, he's got all kinds of classical texts he's going to talk about. He'll conclude by entertaining the thought that his reader, quote, cannot hear the planet-like music of poetry. If that's the case, if the reader has so earth-creeping a mind that it cannot lift itself up to look to the sky of poetry, then he says, I must send you in the behalf of all poets that while you live in love and never get favor of lacking skill of a sonnet, and when you die, your memory die from the earth for want of an epitaph. The final lines, brilliantly constructed. Now, Sidney wrote this in 1579. He died, obviously, as we said before, it was published in 1595. Many are believed to have influenced the work, especially and including Stephen Gossen's work, School of Abuse. This work by Sidney is an early example of English criticism. It does go beyond just studying poetry, right? And it will, and for him, Posey will include pretty much everything, right? Fictional arts, examples from prose and drama. I mean, he'll talk a lot about Plato. He has to respond to Plato's Republic 10 criticism. All of that is going to be a part of this discussion, right? Now let's go through it quickly. As we said, in 1579, Stephen Gossen's published this short book called The School of Abuse, in which he basically just attacked all poets and actors, questioning, really in many ways, the puritanical view, right? The morality of these fictional works. Now, of course, this is not new. You'll remember from our study of Plato's Republic that Plato himself argued that the problem with poets and artists is that they lie. In other words, they construct what is in fact not true at all. Well, now, these comments weren't specifically addressed to Sidney, right? But he was motivated to write his defense of Posey, right? And it had a tremendous influence on English literature, no question. Now, as we said, he divided up his defense of Posey into multiple sections. Let's just go through a few of those. Again, I wish I could read more of this. Maybe I'll end with a few of my favorite lines from this. He begins with the historical importance of poetry. Okay? Now, one of the first points that he makes is that the majority of our scientists have been Roman and before them Greek, and these civilizations obviously placed a great value on the art of poetry, right? The Romans called poets vats and defined them as diviner, foreseer, prophet, right? The Greeks named them poet, which comes from the word poion, meaning to make. And he makes a lot about that fact. They believe writing poetry to be a divine gift based on God's ability to create. He'll say it this way, quote, there is no art delivered to mankind, that hath not the works of nature for his principal object, without which they could not consist, and on which they so depend, as they become actors and players, as it were, of what nature will have set forth," end quote. And then, of course, he goes on to argue that poetry couldn't exist without nature as inspiration, and because nature is a direct result of God's creativity, poetry has a certain sense of divinity that can't be ignored. Go back to earlier lectures, even in our comments on the Iliad and the Odyssey and the Aeneid, especially the Iliad and the Odyssey, that the Greeks believed that there was that thing of the gods, and then there were humans, and in between the poets who were inspired, right? God breathed was their word. That is to say, the gods helped the poet to find information that could then be shared with the rest of humans. Why? Well, two things. Humans, unlike the gods, die, we're mortal, and we're pretty stupid. I mean, we don't have much for knowledge, and so the gods obviously need to provide us with some idea about what this whole thing called this living in this world is all about. The poets are the way that that happens. So we begin with a classical rendering of why, from the very beginning, poets matter. Okay? That is to say, they told the stories. And as we've said many times in 303, we are the stories that we tell, the stories we retell. We're also the stories we accept or decide to reject, no question. He then will begin some defining, right? I mean, remember what Plato said, if you're going to have an argument or a discussion, you need to define your terms. He'll begin, no big shock here for us in 303, with Aristotle. And of course, Poetics is that classic text which talks about drama and the elements of drama, right? He talks about the Aristotelian view of mimesis, which of course is representation, counterfeit, metaphorically, a speaking picture. He writes that although it's possible to view poetry as simply an unoriginal imitation, on the other hand, poets are not limited by the rules of reality. And this brings, obviously, the idea that the skill of an artist is based on the idea and not the art itself. For example, when a painter uses a model, the end result's value is not necessarily a reflection of how closely the piece resembles the original subject, right? And then, of course, due to the lack of limitation, poetry has the ability to surpass the beauty of nature. Art, he says, is a teaching tool. It's a propedeutic, right? That is, it's used to delight and to entertain. It's, of course, divided into all of its subcategories, and he'll talk about each of them and the value of each: the heroic, the lyric, the tragic, the comic, the satiric. Talks about iambic, talks about the elegiac, and as well the pastoral. And of course, by the time of, well, I would for sure say the romantic English poets of Byron, Shelley, and Keats, this notion of all these different types of poems are endemic to what it means to write poetry and to be a poet, right? And of course, Milton, we've talked a lot about why, from Milton, he wanted to be able to write each one of those in some way. Finally, in this section, he goes on to discuss the importance of verse. He clarifies that while verse can be an attribute, it's not a necessity. And there have been many great poets in history that were not, quote-unquote, versifiers, as he calls them. For example, he mentions any number of people who wrote in prose, but they were fundamentally poets. He then goes into a very interesting discussion about the tension between philosophy and history on the one hand and poetry on the other. Okay? Now, this really is a pretty controversial argument in defense of poetry. He discusses the notion of learning. We know about all of that at 303, that connecting of new information to old information in meaningful ways. He defines it as a purifying of wit, sounding almost like Francis Bacon, right, in Of Studies, an enrichment of memory, an enlarging of conceit. Now, he will say that for some, the best way to happiness is through learning and the gaining of knowledge. Those who believe the most important discoveries could be made through astronomy, for example, the study of the stars. Others thought that maybe it was through the study of mathematics and philosophy and music. He'll explain it this way. He says, quote, "But all, one and other, having the scope to know, and by knowledge to lift up the mind from the dungeon of the body to the enjoying his own divine essence." Wonderful Sidney lines, right? However, he does caution against maybe falling too much or immersing oneself too much and too deeply into any individual study using an astronomer whose eyes are constantly trained on the stars falling into a ditch as an example. We're familiar with this with the Aristophanes comedies against Socrates, especially the clouds, right? He goes on to advise that all those studying any sciences devote themselves to their passion, but also to aim for a higher purpose, right, with their discoveries. And he talks about the saddler who makes saddles, aims to make the best saddle, but the further end is, of course, to improve horsemanship of a soldier. It's interesting that he actually begins this little treatise with talking about how he'd been trained in the fighting arts, especially in the equestrian fighting arts, and riding ponies, which is great, right? I mean, he's going to write a treatise on poetry, but he wants to talk about what it takes to be a good soldier as well. After this, he goes on to attempt to prove that poets encompass the best traits of philosophers and historians. He condemns historians because they rely on hearsay of others, being trapped in the past instead of looking towards the future. On the other side, he complains that philosophers are so busy looking towards the future and pondering the what-ifs, if you will, that they don't pay any attention to the present. So he claims that poets have the ability to remember, we think of Proust here, and paint the past while philosophizing about the future. In other words, poets are able to draw from the past. I mean, go back to comments that I make on Milton, when I think Milton is the classic exemplar of this. Chaucer comes to mind as well. They're able to somehow encompass everything that came before them in new and unique ways, but there are also always these visionaries, and Sidney is one of the great presenters of this idea. Poets, artists in general, they're great visionaries. I mean, they kind of see things, and long after the fact, right? We think of Keats immediately, don't we? We go, wow, he was way ahead of his time. Amazing, right? He says it this way. To the second, he claims, I'll back up, he claims that poets who have this ability to remember and paint the past, they have to be recognized as more important than either the historian or the philosopher. And therefore he maintains that poetry represents an artistic perspective on both, right? The past as well as the future. In other words, another way for us to maybe say this is, poets help us to live in the present, right? The next thing he does is he will consider the acrimonious audience, as we talk about. Of course, when you write a good essay, you always think about somebody who's going to say something against your position. And so he's got to answer these charges against poetry, and of course he's considering any number of thinkers of his day, because we're already into the quote-unquote modern scientific age, right, by close to 1600. And therefore, we don't need this silly poetry stuff anymore. So he's going to obviously have to address some of the accusations. Poets are liars, falsifiers, by claiming someone cannot lie if they never attempt to tell the truth in the first place. Poetry, he says, isn't written to record historical details with specific accuracy. It's rather to speak to the virtue of the person writing and the general feelings of the time. He'll say it this way, quote, to the second, therefore, that they should be the principal liars, I will answer paradoxically, but truly, I think truly, that of all writers under the sun, the poet is the least liar, and though he would, as a poet, can scarcely be a liar. Now, one of the main reasons poetry and fictitious literary works were being condemned, of course, because of the ideology that prophesiers were attempting to be greater than God. They were obviously heretics of a kind. Remember, we've got England at the time, very Protestant, very Puritan, and so he uses this rational point to make his audience see that this is really not the purpose of poetry at all. He mentions historians, he mentions astronomers, obviously his point being that these studies fall into the category of liars because they seek to affirm knowledge of mankind, where a poet makes no attempt to do so at all. Finally, in conclusion, he summarizes his main points. He says that while the poet speaks to general truths, love, family, morality, nature, they don't try and prove that they're right or affirm their truths, right? Poetry's a type of literary expression, right? And to that degree, he makes the argument that, it's it's really just about valuing what poets bring to our understanding of the world. So there's any number of passages. Again, I wish I could just sit and read with it for you. He says it this way: "The lawyer saith what men have determined, the historian what men have done. The grammarian speaketh only of the rules of speech, and the rhetorician and logician, considering what in nature will soonest persuade therein, give artificial rules. Only the poet, disdaining to be tied to any such subjugation, lifted up with the vigor of his own invention, doth grow and affect another nature, in making things either better than nature bringeth forth, or quite anew, forms such as never were in nature. Nature never set forth the earth in so rich tapestry as diviners, poets have done. Her world is brazen. The poets only deliver a golden." He says it this way: "Poetry is an art of imitation, for so Aristotle termeth it in the word mimesis. That is to say, a representing, counterfeiting, or figuring forward. To speak metaphorically, a speaking picture, with this end, to teach and delight." You'll remember often we will say in our creative writing discussions, show, don't tell, and much of that comes from, this kind of thing as well. He says it this way: it's not rhyming and versing that maketh a poet, but it is that fainting of notable images of virtues, vices, or what else, with that delightful teaching which must be the right describing note to know a poet by. Now, many will take that line after the fact and look at Shakespeare and begin to think